The story begins with a man completely broken by an extremely intense training, to the point where he's unsure if he can survive. Around him, a group of spectators watches his transformation over the past few years, and they are pleased to see how much he has grown. They think that the upcoming E-rank exam won't be much of a challenge for him. A little while later, the list of participants for the E-rank promotion exam is published. Rick, our protagonist, is one of them. Alicia, the receptionist, smiles when she sees his name. It has been 2 years since they last met, back when Rick was still working as a guild clerk. Alicia is surprised to hear that Rick has now become an adventurer. Rick can't blame her, considering starting an adventurer career at 30 years old is rather unusual. Usually, people start as F-rank apprentices when they're still teenagers, then become E-rank within 2 years. Alicia wonders what happened to Rick during that time. Rick explains that he had been in the mountains, training with a few senior adventurers. As they chat, a drunken man, out of control, tries to approach Alicia. However, Rick calmly subdues him, drawing everyone's attention in the room. Rick reminds everyone to drink responsibly, restoring the peaceful atmosphere. Alicia then gives him the exam ticket and wishes Rick success in the E-rank exam, but Rick feels horrified when he sees the number on his ticket. Later, outside, Rick meets a girl named Rionette and tells her that he has finished registering. Rionette reminds him to stay focused on his goal. Back inside, people are shocked to see the handprint Rick left on the drunken man's armor. They're amazed because the armor is made of steel. Rick himself is surprised by the strength he possesses. Even more shocking, the drunken man turns out to be Dalmold, a former famous E-rank adventurer, who is now a wanted criminal. Alicia, witnessing the event, can't hide her shock. She wonders if Rick has really become so strong that he can leave a mark on steel armor. Moments later, the examiner is also surprised to learn that Rick is already 32 years old. After that, the participants are asked to test their magical energy by placing their hands on a crystal ball. When it's Rick's turn, the light emitted from the crystal is so faint that Rick is only given an F- rating. The participants watching feel sorry for him and hope they don't end up like Rick. However, after Rick leaves, the examiner is startled when the crystal ball suddenly shatters. The next test asks the participants to hit a device that measures their strength. This device can absorb very powerful attacks, so participants are told not to hold back. The device looks like a slime bag, and Rick remembers someone once taught him about this. Rick was taught that the human body is the primary foundation of a fighter, regardless of the weapons or magic they possess. Rick was ordered to destroy the golden slime bag with his bare hands. This golden slime bag was known to be as tough as dragon teeth, and Rick felt it was impossible to break it with just his hands. However, Rick's instructor revealed that the instructor himself could crush 200 golden slime bags at once and demonstrated a bit of his strength. Rick then pushed himself hard, hitting the bag 50,000 times every day, hoping that one day his body would be strong enough to do it. The story continues with an exciting scene where a man astonishes everyone with a powerful strike against the training bag, using reinforcement magic. At that moment, a confident young boy appeared, declaring that it was finally time for him to show off. This wasn't just any boy. This was the second son of the Duke, and rumors had it that even though he was only 11 years old, his magical power was equivalent to C rank. Everyone was stunned as this prodigy prepared to unleash his attack. The setup was grand, captivating everyone's attention, but they were all shocked when the attack turned out to be just a small fireball. Even so, this small fireball still made a huge impact, and people praised him as a genius. Rick was impressed because the boy was able to control level 3 natural fire magic, an extraordinary feat for his age. Rick then remembered his own grueling training days. In his memories, Rick had been trained by a little girl who could launch an incredibly strong fire attack against him. Even though both were using fire magic, the boy's attack looked very different. Rick began to wonder if the boy had compressed his magic to make it safer for indoor use. When Rick's turn came, the examiners didn't expect much from him. They knew that if someone didn't train magic from a young age, the chances of developing later were slim. Rick's dismal magic test result only reinforced this belief, so much so that the examiners even suggested Rick should just give up. But Rick didn't give in so easily. He remembered how hard Rick had trained, even though Rick knew he had started this journey much later than the others. That's when the miracle happened. Rick struck the training bag, and with that one punch, the bag was utterly destroyed. Everyone was stunned, including Rick himself, who couldn't believe his own strength. Rick even wondered if the bag was broken before he hit it. The other participants could only stand there, wondering who this man really was. But the surprises didn't stop there. The young boy who had stolen the spotlight earlier was now furious that Rick had taken all the attention away from him. Rick planned to show off his abilities in the upcoming endurance test. A little while later, it was Rick's turn to demonstrate his ability to endure magical attacks. This time, Rick had to withstand a level 4 natural magic attack, but to everyone's astonishment, Rick was able to withstand it using only level 1 defense magic. The examiners were amazed to hear this and decided to raise the difficulty of the test. The examiner announced that they would use a level 5 attack spell and advised Rick to use higher level defense magic than level 1. However, Rick shocked everyone again by revealing that he could only use level 1 magic, both for attack and defense. Even so, Rick remained confident that he could handle it. The examiner, feeling insulted, decided not to hold back anymore and unleashed an extremely powerful level 5 attack. The attack was so fierce that it made everyone, even those far from the arena, worry. Elsewhere, a man named Sylvester heard about Rick and his incredible abilities. Sylvester didn't believe that anyone could withstand a level 5 attack using only level 1 defense magic, but the reports about Rick piqued his curiosity. After the written exam was over, Rick felt confident that he would pass, though Rick still faced other challenges ahead. It was at that moment that the prodigy, Freed, angrily approached Rick. Freed, feeling that his spotlight had been stolen, started provoking Rick. Rick, who barely recognized the boy, thought Freed was lost and offered to help him find his parents, which only made Freed angrier. Tensions escalated when Freed's older sister, Angelica, arrived at the scene. Seeing her brother in tears, Angelica immediately challenged Rick to a duel, even though Rick tried to explain that he had merely dirted his gloves. However, the challenge couldn't be avoided, and the duel became inevitable. After a while, they both arrived at an arena, and Angelica firmly declared that she must punish the old man in front of her. In duels within the kingdom, each participant has the right to propose one condition as a wager. Angelica, with confidence, suggested that whoever lost would have to become the winner's servant for life. Her brother gave his full support. Angelica was a second-class knight, and this fact left Rick astonished. Equivalent to a B-rank adventurer, capable of taking down monsters alone, Angelica was no ordinary opponent, but Rionette still urged Rick to remain calm and not worry too much. Rick nervously explained that he was merely an F-rank adventurer who had only registered a few days ago. Fear loomed in his mind, imagining he might not survive this duel. However, Rionette reminded him to rely on the training Rick had undergone over the past 2 years. A montage of Rick's grueling training flashed in his mind, giving him a glimmer of hope, even though it was so intense it almost made him sick. Rionette encouraged him to be confident, reminding him of the elite group that had trained him. The group, known as the Orichalcum Fist, was the strongest on the continent, and they considered Rick one of their own. With this support, Rick regained his confidence and stepped forward to face Angelica. Angelica, knowing that Rick was only F-rank, reassured him that she wouldn't take his life in this duel. As they prepared to fight, Rick quickly realized that Angelica was the type of fighter who enhanced her strength with magic. Angelica had perfect balance between her body and weapon, showing just how experienced she was on the battlefield. As the duel began, Angelica swiftly launched an attack so fast that Rick could hardly believe his eyes. Angelica's speed was incredible, leaving him wondering how Rick could possibly keep up. She even slowed down a bit for Rick, which only made him question why everyone called her the Lightning. Rick managed to dodge the attack with ease, though Angelica considered it mere luck. However, Rick wasn't too impressed, feeling that Angelica's speed didn't live up to her reputation. While thinking that perhaps Angelica earned her knight title through nepotism, Rick continued to dodge every attack with careful precision. Angelica, who began stumbling in her last strike, left Rick almost in disbelief, wondering if the stumble was intentional. He responded cautiously, afraid that a wrong move would trigger an even more terrifying attack. After several missed attacks, dust swirled around the arena, obscuring everyone's view. As the dust began to settle, a large hole created by Rick's attack became visible. Angelica was horrified, imagining that if she hadn't stumbled, that strike would have hit her directly. Rick, unaware of the impact, thought Angelica had deliberately avoided his attack. He didn't consider himself the victor, but Rionette reminded him that the duel was over, and now it was time to find out the results of their exam. As Angelica realized her inevitable defeat, she surrendered and immediately wanted to leave the arena. However, Rick reminded her of the duel's terms, which made Angelica even more desperate to escape. Although Rick hadn't proposed anything, Angelica felt trapped by the humiliating fate of becoming a lifelong servant. Just when Rick thought everything was over, he suddenly heard that other team members had been defeated. With a growing sense of anxiety, he realized that something bigger was awaiting him. The next day, all participants were informed that their test results would soon be released. Their strengths would be sent to their exam tickets, and if the ticket glowed blue, it meant they had passed. Those who passed would then proceed to a mock battle for the second stage of the exam. Rionette, seeing that Rick was starting to get nervous, tried to calm him down. Rionette said, You need to have more confidence. Her kindness made Rick feel a little more at ease, even though Rionette herself wasn't too concerned about the results. In fact, if Rick failed, Rionette had already resolved to double his training. Rick felt he couldn't endure such intense training again, but his worry vanished instantly when he saw his card glow blue. Rick passed the exam. However, his joy was suddenly interrupted when Rick smelled something awful. At the same time, a nobleman named Raster appeared and introduced himself. With an overly elegant attitude, Raster complimented Rionette's beauty. Rick tried to introduce himself to the fellow exam participant, but Raster immediately rejected him, declaring that he had no business with an old man like Rick. Raster then launched into a cheesy line, saying that he had dropped something, not an object, but his deep love into Rionette's eyes. Confidently, Raster declared he wanted to make Rionette his wife. But before anything could happen, Rick quickly interrupted and stated that Rionette was his girlfriend. Raster mocked Rick for still being in the F rank at his not-so-young age. But Rick wasn't about to back down. He pointed out that Raster himself seemed to be around 25 years old. Hearing this, Raster simply called Rick an idiot. Raster then revealed that he had reached E rank at the age of 14, and now he was at A rank. More than that, Raster would be one of the examiners for the second stage of the test. With a condescending tone, Raster told Rionette to get rid of Rick, but they were both shocked when Rionette firmly rejected Raster's offer and declared that she was, in fact, dating Rick. Rionette even embarrassed Raster by criticizing his disgusting cologne, and Rick realized that the foul smell from earlier came from him. Feeling humiliated, Raster was furious and warned Rick to hope that he wouldn't be his examiner in the next test. Rick felt a bit guilty and apologized to Rionette for claiming she was his girlfriend. But to his surprise, Rionette didn't mind. She was actually glad Rick had helped her escape that creepy situation. On the other hand, Raster started to feel a deep hatred for Rick and vowed to teach him a lesson. It was at this moment that we learned Fried and Angelica are Raster's siblings, and they complained about an old man who had bullied them. This only fueled Raster's anger, and he swore never to forgive the old man who made his family cry. His siblings gave him Rick's exam number, and Raster decided he wouldn't stay silent. Raster devised a sneaky plan. The next day, Rionette warned Rick to hold back his strength during the mock battle, but Rick didn't understand the reason behind the warning. At that moment, a man named Lynx explained that he would be responsible for testing Rick in the second stage. Rick felt relieved that his examiner wasn't Raster, but found it strange that a man in his 30s like Lynx had decided to become an adventurer. Rick thought Lynx was underestimating him, but in reality, Lynx was impressed by Rick's determination. Lynx, a middle-aged man, was inspired by Rick's spirit. At the end of their conversation, Lynx realized that Rick had a strong goal motivating him, and Rick was amazed that Lynx could see that. Lynx explained that they had a lot in common. Lynx himself became an adventurer at 25, and now, in his 40s, he was still chasing his dream of reaching A rank after 20 years of struggle. Rick could see that Lynx wouldn't give up on his dream, just like him. Rick then began to look forward to the exam with newfound enthusiasm. They even planned to have a drink together after the exam, but unbeknownst to them, Raster overheard their conversation. After Lynx left, he thought about how hard Rick had trained, just from their handshake. This inspired Lynx to train even harder, but suddenly Raster appeared and said he wanted to talk. Meanwhile, Rionette noticed that Rick was in a good mood, but suddenly, the other participants in Rick's group were told that Lynx had fallen ill. Rick didn't recognize the name when they were informed that the replacement was Raster, but Rick was shocked when Rionette explained that Raster was the man wearing the perfume they had met yesterday. Rick suspected that Raster might be connected to the noble they encountered earlier, and everyone in the group started to feel afraid because Raster was known as a man with 1,000 spells and had a more terrifying nickname, the F-rank Destroyer. This nickname was given because Raster was known to torture participants who caught his attention. Hearing this, Rick became scared since he had more than caught Raster's attention. Elsewhere, Raster showed off his immense power by easily eliminating one of his opponents. Rick, pacing with worry, knew he had angered a man who knew 1,000 spells. Rick considered himself just an F-rank adventurer who only knew the first-level nature magic, and he wished he could just go home. But Rick knew that going home would only make his training 3 times harder, so he felt doomed no matter what he did. Rick lost all confidence as people continued to mock his age, but Rionette believed that Rick could still turn things around. Instead of losing confidence, Rick gained new motivation every time someone insulted him. Though Rick was still doubtful, Rionette believed in Rick's strength and was convinced he would defeat Raster and pass the exam. Rionette had believed in Rick since the first day he decided to become an adventurer, and that belief reignited Rick's spirit. At that exact moment, a stranger called Rick, "Young man," and this person seemed to notice that Rick was struggling with something. The stranger complimented Rick's youth and offered to read his fortune. At first, Rick was hesitant, but the man offered the first reading for free, and Rick couldn't resist his curiosity, so he decided to take a break and sit down. However, Rionette noticed a magic circle on the chair, and suddenly, Rick disappeared. The stranger then revealed himself as Freed, declaring that he was a great actor. An enraged Rionette demanded to know where Freed had sent Rick, but Freed refused to say anything. In her anger, Rionette displayed her terrifying power and sliced off Freed's eyelashes with the slightest movement. Rionette frightened Freed further by stating that she would take one of his eyes next, even letting him choose which one to lose. The terrified Freed finally revealed that he could only teleport Rick about 100 meters away, so Rick should be nearby. Not far from there, Rick found himself outside the area, surrounded by a group of serious-looking men. A man who appeared to be the head butler explained that they were the elite guards of the Diarmid family, and they needed Rick to take a little nap. Rick started realizing that this noble family always seemed to bother him, and the guards told him their task was to ensure Rick couldn't take the exam. Rick felt annoyed, but not surprised, as he had already suspected things would turn out like this. They always used dirty tricks to trip him up. The head butler even casually explained that their power was on par with Vienna ranks, making Rick realize he didn't stand a chance. At that moment, a group of people Rick recognized as senior members of his party suddenly appeared. They seemed confused to see Rick outside when he was supposed to be taking the exam. The guards also looked surprised to see the large, muscular man who resembled an orc. Nervous, Rick suddenly lied and said that his group was just helping him warm up before the exam. The orc-like man offered to help as well, but Rick only became more anxious. Rick begged the head butler to have his men stand down for their own safety, but the head butler ignored him and ordered the guards to take them all out. One of the guards tried to attack the orc-like man, but his sword shattered to pieces when it struck the man's head, which didn't move an inch. The orc, who turned out to be a real orc, praised the guard for reinforcing his body but suggested the guard should also strengthen his weapon. The guard tried to punch the orc, but his blow was easily stopped, injuring his hand instead. Casually, the orc healed the guard's hand and gave him some tips on how to fight better. A blonde man from Rick's group, seeing the situation, realized that Rick must be in big trouble, and the blonde man felt he needed to resolve this peacefully. However, the blonde man's definition of peaceful was a bit different. He pulled out a strange weapon and explained that it was his latest invention, a gun that fired magic-filled crystals. The guards tried to attack him, but they ended up paying the price and experienced the power of the blonde man's weapon firsthand. Rick tried to stop them, but the blonde man misunderstood, thinking Rick wanted to try the weapon. Rick was just worried that the weapon would make the situation worse. At that moment, one of the guards came up with the crazy idea of taking a little girl from Rick's group hostage. The guard threatened to kill the girl, making Rick terrified and wonder if the guard really had the guts to do it. Even the orc tried to warn the guard to let the girl go for his own safety. The little girl, who was confused by the situation, remained calm as Rick tried to comfort her by saying they were just playing a game. However, the guard stupidly revealed his malicious intent. The little girl became angry, and Rick knew right then that these guards were done for. The girl quickly destroyed the foolish guard, and everyone was stunned by how powerful the magic she unleashed was, without even chanting a spell. The head butler finally realized who the little girl was. Her name was Elisarette, the strongest sorceress at just 10 years old, known as the Demon Child of Destruction. And Elisarette wasn't the only great person in the group. The blonde man was Mizet, a half-elf, half-dwarf who was the best weaponsmith in the world. Many believed he had technology from 1,000 years in the future. Meanwhile, the orc was Brufston, a support magic expert with extraordinary intelligence and super strength. The guards were completely shocked to hear that they were all members of the famous S-rank group, Orichalk and Fist. The old head butler had seen enough and decided to retire and live out the rest of his life in peace. Elisarette then effortlessly destroyed all the enemies with a single-word spell, and Rick, who didn't want to keep getting stuck with these crazy people, finally resolved to do his best to pass the exam and return to his peaceful life. Back at the scene, Rionette was still happily torturing Freed. Freed began to wonder how long she was going to keep breaking things. Casually, Rionette replied that she would keep doing it until Rick came back. Freed, confident that Rick wouldn't return, was shocked out of his mind when Rick suddenly appeared and greeted him casually. Rionette immediately sent Freed, the little bookworm, flying into the wall. Rick could only wonder what had happened here. But Rionette calmly responded, "Everything's fine. I'm just destroying a small part of this building." In the middle of the conversation, a badly injured Lynx appeared. He told Rick that he had just been beaten up by Raster. Rick felt horrified, realizing that Raster had done this so he could take over his exam. Lynx then shared his simple dream. Lynx wanted to build a school in his hometown. But unfortunately, Raster just mocked and tortured him mercilessly. Lynx couldn't do much against someone as strong as Raster, and now Lynx felt that dreaming at his age was nothing but foolishness. Lynx was worried that Raster would do something far worse to Rick, so Lynx begged Rick to back out of the exam. But Rick firmly refused. Lynx then declared that Lynx wanted everyone to know that it doesn't matter what age you start something. Elsewhere, Raster was busy beating up his own subordinates. One of his guards informed him that there was an intruder. Hearing this, Raster was thrilled, realizing that Rick had finally decided to come. He thought Rick would have given up by now, but it didn't matter, as he planned to show Rick what true fear looked like. With full confidence, Raster showcased his magic. However, Rick angrily said that he would send Raster flying. In this situation, a man had to do something, but the man didn't know what to do. A man named Adolf was watching the E-rank test and explained the 4 important basic abilities: physical strength, body control, magic reserves, and magic control. Adolf had a unique ability to visualize the scores of others' 4 basic abilities. When Adolf checked Raster, he was amazed by Raster's A-rank score, but his eyes felt a bit strained because it was dangerous for him to stare at someone too powerful. Then, Adolf decided to check Rick's stats. The results were so astounding that Adolf's eyes felt like they were going to explode, and he screamed in pain. Nearby, Alicia and Rionette were introducing themselves to each other. Another member of Rionette's group called her to join, so Rionette invited Alicia to come along. Alicia was surprised to see an orc sitting there. Rionette refused Mizzet's offer to sit beside her because she knew Mizzet had bad intentions. Mizzet, who was interested in Alicia, offered his seat, but Rionette quickly led Alicia to a safer spot. Meanwhile, Rick finally entered the arena. Rick was very close to Raster. Raster's siblings cheered for him, and Raster was impressed that Rick managed to get past his guards. Raster then declared that he was different from those weak guards, and Rick could tell just by looking at him. Rick then asked, why did Raster become an adventurer? It turned out that Raster was a noble, and he did it just to boost his status. In fact, Raster was already bored with being an adventurer, and was just waiting for the right time to quit. Rick realized that someone like Raster wasn't a true adventurer, so Rick wouldn't lose to someone like this. Raster started the attack with a level 1 spell, but Raster was puzzled why Rick wasn't moving at all. Rick wasn't afraid. He was just reminding himself not to let his anger get the best of him. Rionette suggested that Rick use the first minute of the fight to calm down and observe his opponent. Rick followed the advice, but the impatient Raster immediately launched a level 3 spell without chanting. The powerful attack hit Rick, but Rick stood firm while analyzing his opponent. Alicia was worried, but Brufston said that an attack like that was nothing to Rick. Brufston explained that out of the 4 basic abilities, magic reserves had to be developed before someone turned 20. Otherwise, there was no hope for further growth. Rick became an adventurer at the age of 30, so his magic reserves were very low. However, Brufston had a solution, and we flash back to the past. Brufston had once told Rick that the one thing Rick could always rely on was his body. Rick then decided to head to the next town, but Rick was tied to a giant 100-kilogram weight. Rick was horrified, but Brufston just told him to hurry up because there was a nest of carnivorous monsters in the forest. To make up for his lack of magic reserves, Rick was trained intensely in the other 3 abilities. Raster then attacked with a level 4 spell, but once again, Rick remained unaffected. Brufston then revealed that he was the one who built Rick's physical strength from scratch. Even though Mizzet hated doing troublesome things, he was the one who taught Rick how to control magic. Mizzet took on this responsibility because he didn't want Rick to turn into ashes after an attack one day. Rionette trained Rick in body control, and Alicia was surprised to learn that Rionette wasn't just an ordinary servant. It turned out that Rick had diligently followed all the training given to him, and now Rick was in the realm of S rank like the others. Raster unleashed another attack, and Rionette explained that Rick wasn't aware of how strong he had become. This was because, no matter how tough the training they gave him, they always told him that an F rank should be able to handle it easily. Just like Brufston had once said, an F rank should be able to crush a large rock with a single punch. Raster kept hurling taunts as he launched a series of attacks, and Alicia was horrified when one of the attacks seemed to destroy Rick. Raster mockingly said that maybe he had gone overboard, but Raster was shocked when Rick emerged unscathed. Raster felt unsettled by Rick's resilience, and even his siblings were amazed by Rick's strength. Raster then fortified himself to finish the battle with his fists, but Rick easily knocked him down. Rick finally understood what Rionette meant. Raster was too obsessed with the talent he was born with, so he forgot to refine and develop it. Raster had large magic reserves, but he was careless in everything he did. Facing an opponent like Raster, Rick was confident he wouldn't lose. Raster stubbornly insisted that Rick was just lucky, and his siblings were amazed when Raster finally decided to use a full incantation spell. His long incantation resulted in a massive, crazy fireball attack, but everyone was shocked when Rick effortlessly stopped it with just one hand. Rick then commented that the attack was too careless, and Mizit explained that Rick was using his magic with a high degree of precision to block the attack. Rick was so meticulous that he only needed to use a fraction of the energy Raster had used to create the attack. This meant that someone like Rick with minimal magic reserves could achieve the same feat as long as they had proper magic control. Raster kept insisting that Rick was merely lucky, launching yet another attack. However, Rick was too fast for him, forcing Raster to transform his body into steel to fight better. Now, Raster could use his full abilities to avoid the looming defeat. Although Raster eventually acknowledged that Rick's abilities were far above an E rank, he still claimed it was all due to luck. Rick couldn't understand why Raster refused to acknowledge his strength. Rick then explained that he hadn't even used magic yet, only body control. But Raster, with deep curiosity, wondered how Rick had become so strong in just 2 years. That question insulted Rick, reminding him of how brutal and grueling his training had been. Rick had to run through explosions, swim through monster-catching liquids to the point of almost choking. All of this was part of brutal training, sometimes leaving him unable to leave a dragon's lair except by defeating it. Alicia was horrified hearing about the extreme training Rick had undergone, as no one should have been able to survive any of it. But her shock grew even more when Brufston revealed that Rick didn't always survive. Rick had lost his life multiple times, but Brufston was able to revive him as long as the healing was done immediately after death. Mizit, one of Rick's closest friends, was also impressed by Rick's resilience and refusal to give up, even though the training was insane. Mizit recalled the time Mizit trained Rick by kicking him off a mountain so that Rick could develop the ability to see the wind. Of course, this caused Rick to lose his life repeatedly, and Brufston had to revive him each time. Alysseret, another mentor, also felt guilty about her brutal training methods. Alysseret once crushed Rick under a pile of massive rocks as part of his training. Rionet, another one of Rick's trainers, even had Rick learn to chop down fallen trees relying solely on his own momentum, a training method that once again caused Rick to lose his life. However, Raster still didn't believe it. Raster thought Rick was lying, refusing to accept that such horrific training could exist. And even if it did, Raster couldn't imagine anyone being motivated enough to endure all of that. Rick simply replied that his dream was his source of motivation. His dream was to defeat the strongest monster in the world, Kaiser Alsapiet. Hearing that, Raster and Fried burst into laughter, thinking Rick was an idiot who couldn't possibly be serious. Alicia, who knew that Kaiser Alsapiet was the most powerful legendary monster in the world, began to realize how immense Rick's dream was. Even Raster, who was also part of the legends of the hero Yamato, started to understand that Rick's goal was the ultimate mission of their group, Oracle Confist. Despite this, Raster still mocked Rick, saying that the legends of the hero Yamato was just a bedtime story for kids, and defeating Alsapiet was a ridiculous dream. Finally, Raster agreed to finish their battle. Raster surprisingly used level 7 magic to restrain Rick, but before Rick could react, Raster warned him not to go to the labyrinth yet. Raster planned to show Rick what real talent looked like and make sure Rick would never talk nonsense again. With full confidence, Raster finished his long incantation and announced that he would show everyone the greatness of level 8 nature creation magic, the greatest magic ever wielded by humans. This was Raster's ultimate technique, a man with 1,000 spells in his arsenal. With that magic, Raster controlled a giant tree golem from within, commanding Rick to bow before him. Rick remained calm, stating that he would punch right through it, but Raster just laughed, thinking Rick was hallucinating. Rick then asked how many times Raster had practiced using the golem, but Raster couldn't recall, as he felt he had mastered it after only a few tries. Calmly, Rick revealed that he had performed his air shot attack 100 million times. Raster's siblings didn't believe it, and Alicia wondered if doing something 100 million times in 2 years was even physically possible. However, Brufston revealed that it was possible, but only with the use of space-time magic. Raster had heard enough, so he decided it was time to crush Rick's dreams, just like he had done with Lynx. Raster unleashed his strongest level 8 attack, but Rick calmly broke free from it, and shocked everyone by stopping the attack with just a level 1 air shot. Raster, who had been so confident before, started to feel the pressure as his golem began to crumble. Not long after, Rick's air shot completely shattered Raster's golem. Raster couldn't believe something like this could happen to him. His golem was destroyed, and Raster was thrown into the stands. Rick, while mocking the noble elite who had underestimated him, showed that his dream remained intact and unwavering. Rick's friends congratulated him on his victory, and Rick finally realized just how much stronger he had become. Rick couldn't even believe how powerful he truly was until that moment, and felt deeply grateful to everyone who had helped him. At that moment, they heard Raster's siblings calling for medical attention for him, but Raster was still determined to speak directly with Rick. Rick could sense that Raster was curious about how a rookie like Rick could defeat an elite player like him. Fried was about to defend his brother, but Rick simply explained to Raster how he limited the number of techniques he used and focused on mastering them deeply. Rick gave some advice to Raster about how he could do the same, but Raster brushed it off. Raster swore he would win next time, and his siblings left with him. However, Angelica surprisingly showed Rick some respect. The next day, the names of the participants who passed the E-rank exam were announced over the loudspeaker. They were called out one by one, and Rick waited patiently, surrounded by the other participants. Rionette was surprised by how calm Rick was, so Rick explained that he was just thinking about something. Rick reflected on his past, and how he had always wanted to be like Yamato, a great adventurer who tried to defeat Emperor Alsatiate. Unfortunately, his mother thought the dream was too dangerous, while his father wanted Rick to stop believing in fairy tales. One day, Rick found new hope when a doctor discovered that he had an extremely rare innate skill marker. Rick was shocked to learn that he might have the potential for strength like Yamato, but the doctor told him that this skill couldn't be achieved through training alone. Rick decided to keep waiting for his skill to manifest. He was enthusiastic and determined to tell his parents that he would become an adventurer once his skill finally emerged. Day after day passed, and even though his friends wondered if his skill had shown up yet, Rick remained full of hope, believing it would reveal itself once he was no longer seen as a child. Eventually, despair began to creep in. Rick was told that there were cases where people with that marker never showed any abilities on this planet. His friends also mentioned that there were many adventurers without skills, and they encouraged Rick to still become an adventurer even without any special abilities. They also talked about the potential earnings from such work, but to Rick, money wasn't everything. One day, his mother was thrilled to hear that Rick had been accepted as a receptionist at a guild. His parents were proud that Rick had secured a stable job, and Rick accepted that this was now his path in life. Even so, Rick continued testing to see if his skill would finally manifest. Years went by, and his parents grew older, but Rick never stopped reading about the legend of Yamato. His daily life as a receptionist didn't stop him from continuing to pursue his dream. One day, Rick explained to Alicia that monsters had been driven out of their nests, and were starting to roam around the city. The situation was becoming dangerous, and new missions were about to be announced. These missions mostly involved low-level monsters, so Rick thought it would be a downgraded mission. Rick's friend, Zaid, had just been promoted to rank B, an achievement that allowed someone to live solely by adventuring. Rick congratulated Zaid but couldn't help feeling frustrated himself. Rick was annoyed because he had been doing the same job for 14 years without any significant results. Meanwhile, Zaid had already experienced several promotions in his career. Rick's life, on the other hand, was stable and without too many complaints. Still, Rick constantly thought about how far he could have gone if he had chosen to become an adventurer. Suddenly, Rick heard loud screams as a giant monster appeared in the city. Rick was shocked since mid-level monsters rarely showed up in a place like this. Eagerly, Rick rushed to protect a girl from danger, but the girl instead asked Rick to step aside. Not long after, the girl effortlessly destroyed the monster, leaving Rick in awe. She simply thanked him for his effort, and that was the first time Rick met Rionette. Rionette revealed that she was an adventurer. Rick, who still didn't know much about the world of adventuring, guessed that Rionette might be rank B, but it turned out she wasn't. When Rionette revealed that she was ranked S, Rick was extremely surprised and nervous. Rank S is the highest level, and Rick was curious about what it would be like to meet someone with that rank. Rionette explained that she hadn't laughed at all for the past 9 years since she was 8 years old. Rick decided to open up and share his dream of defeating Kaiser Alsatiate. Rick also mentioned his innate skills that made him confident he could become a great adventurer. At 30 years old, Rick asked Rionette if there was still time for him to pursue that dream. Rionette acknowledged Rick's courage for trying to save her, but reminded him that at 30 years old, and without training from a young age, building magical endurance would be very difficult. Even though Rick was aware of these limitations, Rionette stressed that the magical ability required to be an adventurer is crucial, and Rick might not have a chance. Rick remained positive, thanking Rionette for telling him the truth. Rick felt relieved to finally let go of a dream that he should have abandoned long ago. Rionette apologized, but Rick felt he needed to hear it. They chatted enthusiastically, and Rick even invited her to dinner. Rionette accepted the invitation, and they planned to meet the next day. The next day, Alicia noticed that Rick was in a good mood and seemed excited. When Zaid arrived, Rick happily gave him his mission. Rick couldn't believe he was going to have dinner with someone like Rionette, and felt that his life wasn't actually that bad. However, the cheerful atmosphere was shattered when monsters started running amok in the city. Rick was worried, especially since he saw Rionette involved in the situation, but Rick remembered that Rionette could take care of herself. More monsters appeared, and Rionette told Rick that she would handle everything. Rick realized how impressive the abilities of a rank S were as he watched Rionette destroy the monsters. However, Rionette suddenly felt anxious and fainted due to the terrifying magical energy. Other monsters began to attack them, and Zaid appeared to save them along with some other adventurers. They quickly began to work together to eliminate the monsters. Rick felt disappointed because he thought he had given up on becoming an adventurer. However, watching the group battle made him realize how envious he still was of them. Rionette warned him about the dangers around, but Rick felt they could handle the situation because Zaid was rank B. Rionette, still scared, explained that rank B wouldn't be enough to fight the threats around here. Rick was shocked to hear that the threat was a dragon. Rionette explained that whenever she sensed the presence of a dragon, she lost control of her magic. Rick couldn't believe a dragon was appearing here, but he was quickly proven wrong. A giant dragon appeared before them, and even Zaid was surprised. Everyone in the Adventurers Guild had been taught that anyone below rank B should never try to fight a dragon. A man from their group tried to attack the dragon, but it quickly became clear that there was no way to fight a dragon with just its powerful wing strength. The group decided to flee for their safety, but they were stopped by a barrier created by the dragon. They couldn't break through the barrier, and the dragon didn't seem inclined to let them escape. Zaid gave up, convinced that their lives were over, but Rick surprised everyone by stepping forward. Even though Rick felt hopeless, he thought that if he could at least get closer to the dragon, he might be able to last a little longer. Rick felt completely burned out after facing the dragon directly. Seeing how formidable the creature was, Rick realized they wouldn't be able to put up a significant fight. Fear engulfed him, but amidst it all, Rick felt a spark of determination he had never experienced before. With great courage, Rick tried to throw a rock at the dragon, but the creature seemed utterly unfazed. Seeing Rick's bold action, Zaid felt inspired and tried to share this with the other adventurers. The inspired adventurers finally attacked the dragon with renewed energy. The extremely powerful dragon used its fiery breath against them, but Zaid managed to protect them for a moment by turning everyone into iron. Unfortunately, the dragon's attacks were too strong and caused many injuries, making Zaid feel that this might be the end for them. Rionette felt very disappointed that she couldn't fight the dragon, and as the dragon prepared to destroy them all, hope seemed to be lost. However, they were all shocked to see Rick emerging from the rubble. With deep determination, Rick vowed to realize his dream, no matter the risks. Rionette could only watch in horror as the dragon crushed Rick. Suddenly, a mysterious voice announced that Rick had acquired a new skill. Everyone was stunned as they saw Rick easily lifting the dragon's foot. No one could believe what they were seeing, and Rick looked very different from usual, radiating an aura of magic. Rick realized that his new skill had just awakened and wondered why it had taken so long. With newfound confidence, Rick challenged the dragon to unleash all its power so Rick could test his abilities. The dragon continued its attacks, but Rick managed to handle them all and eventually fought back with an attack strong enough to break through the dragon's barrier and injure the creature. Everyone, including Rick, was stunned by what had just happened. Rick humbly mentioned that it wasn't too bad before he fainted. After a while, Rick woke up with excruciating pain and discovered that all the magic circuits in his body were damaged. Rick was shocked to hear that Rionette had been waiting for him all this time and decided to invite him to join her group, Orichalcum Fist. Rick was extremely surprised by the offer, especially when he learned that they shared the same goal of defeating Kaiser Alsapiat. Rick was amazed that the dragon was real, and Rionette was confident that Rick would grow stronger and be able to join her group. Rionette assured him that Rick would become an adventurer, and it was the first time someone had said something like that to him. Back in the present, Rick was announced as a fully qualified adventurer, and Rionette congratulated him. Rick praised his mentor and thanked his past self for never giving up on his dream. Rick agreed to meet with Lynx and invited him to meet his party. However, Lynx felt strange because Rick asked him to wear his strongest gear. Upon arriving at what appeared to be the Demon King's castle, Lynx was greeted by Rick and was shocked to see Elisarette easily using a level 6 spell. Rick saved Lynx from destruction and scolded Elisarette for using magic in the palace. Elisarette, who just wanted to play, asked for forgiveness, and Rick decided to spend time with her to calm her down. Lynx then admired the vastness of the place and met Mizet, who explained that making crazy weapons was his hobby. Lynx tried his latest weapon and was stunned by its power and impact. Finally, Lynx met Brufston, who was surrounded by books and wondered if this intellectual orc was also a party member. Lynx began to realize how extraordinary this place was and felt impressed by everything he saw. Brufston said he had read almost every book in his library, but lately, he hadn't had much time to read because he was busy training Rick. Brufston also offered Lynx the chance for additional training, and Lynx eagerly accepted the offer. Brufston was happy to see the look in Lynx's eyes. Brufston felt the same light he once saw in Rick. Sometime later, Rick was very shocked when he found out that Lynx had gone to the forest with Brufston. Rick immediately thought of the dangers that might await them there. Next, we see Lynx terrified, screaming because he feels his life is about to end. He jumps off the mountain, bidding farewell to his wife and children. Fortunately, Lynx lands safely on a pile of food Rionette had prepared for dinner. Lynx notices the heavy burden he's carrying and realizes it's all because of Brufston. Lynx confirms this, explaining that Brufston made him slide down a steep slope that was almost like a cliff. Lynx is sure that if it weren't for Rionette, he would have died there. He even says that Brufston makes Rick's life worse than any other trainer. Lynx was so scared that he pretended not to hear what Rick was saying. When Brufston showed up to continue the training, Lynx was relieved to still be alive and told Rick that Brufston should give lighter training. Rick warned Lynx that he couldn't just trust someone when they say their training is easy. Brufston came and showed that he could revive someone if the training made them pass out. Rick reminded him how fragile life is, while Alysseret, out of patience, just wanted to play again. While waiting for dinner, Lynx wondered how close Rick was to Rionette. Rick explained that their relationship was nothing more than friendship, especially since he felt too old for her. Lynx surprised Rick by sharing that he and his wife had a 20-year age gap, encouraging Rick by saying that what matters is how they feel about each other. That night, everyone enjoyed the feast prepared by Rionette and praised her for it. When Rionette went to get some wine, Lynx told Rick that this was a great opportunity to help her so they could get closer. Rick hurried to assist Rionette, while Lynx grew curious about Rick's innate abilities. Brufston explained that Rick's abilities are the kind that activate under certain conditions, so Rick couldn't trigger them on his own. However, thanks to the magical stone used to defeat the Ursi Helion in Czechia, spells like Grand Psalm and the 6 jewels would activate every 200 years. This meant they would need to release a large amount of magic during that time. Lynx often doubted stories like this, but hearing their explanation made him believe it more. Lynx promised to check the secret department for more information about the stone. Meanwhile, Rick asked if Lynx had any other advice. Rick tried to help Rionette as suggested, but Rick felt that Rionette was very capable and didn't need much assistance. The next day, a new adventurer was confused about why the adventurer girl had to clean the guild even though she could defeat monsters. The adventurer girl saw Brufston trying to take on a certain job but getting rejected. Brufston was puzzled because the job only had a danger level of 82 and was easy to handle. The adventurer girl thought this group seemed strange and wondered how they could help Lynx. She had never seen the guild master act like this before. Rick used his receptionist skills to ensure they could take on the job, as long as there were 2 A-ranked members in a group of 4. Brufston asked if they could get help finding the 4th person, and the guild master agreed. The receptionist assigned a girl named Ray to join, though Ray was a bit hesitant about the strange-looking group. The guild master assured her that they were great adventurers, even though all she saw was a talking orc, a small girl, and an old man. Ray decided to lend her strength after all, and they began their quest. The group explained that they were looking for a magical stone. Lynx mentioned that the stone should be in the area. Ray wondered if the stone was worth a lot of money. The stone is indeed valuable, but it can be dangerous if not handled carefully because it can attract monsters. Ray felt confident she could handle any monsters, even though she was currently only ranked F. Rionette had already returned home, so she hoped everything would be fine. Meanwhile, Mizet reminded them that since Brufston was with them, they were safe. The small and quirky Mizet then tried to use his gadget to peek at Rionette's underwear, but Rionette stopped him and destroyed the machine. Back with Rick, Brufston confirmed that they were heading towards the lair they were looking for. Ray was scared to see the wyvern, shocked that they were searching for a wyvern's nest, and warned Brufston not to approach the creature without a solid plan. However, Brufston didn't seem worried and told the monster to move aside as he sent it flying across the forest. Brufston declared that his plan was just to defeat any monster he encountered, which was exactly what he wanted. Brufston warned Rick to take Ray to a safe place before she was completely overwhelmed, and Ray was visibly terrified by the imminent danger. Rick took Ray to an open field, reminding her that she had to be strong enough to face this situation. Just then, a wyvern was flung next to them. They watched as Alysseret and Brufston swiftly took down the horde of wyverns threatening them. Ray, witnessing everything with wide eyes, was utterly shocked at how far they could throw the wyverns. But the biggest surprise came when a giant red creature appeared before her. Even an A-ranked fighter would struggle against a beast of that size, so Ray felt that running was the best option. Rick agreed that running was a wise move, but there was something he wanted to check first. Despite the odds, Rick was reluctant to back down. Seeing how determined Rick was, Ray decided to fight alongside him. Ray began preparing a protective spell but could hardly believe it when Rick effortlessly destroyed the giant. He celebrated enthusiastically, as this proved just how strong he truly was. The next day, Ray felt utterly exhausted. The guild master explained that nothing good ever happened when Auric Helsam Fist appeared, and yesterday's experience made Ray wonder about the fate of the wyvern corpses. Rick explained that Rionette would be processing them for dinner. Ray found it hard to believe that anyone would want to eat wyvern, so the guild master explained that the members of Auric Helsam Fist were the strongest on the continent. This experience, though frightening, only motivated Ray to train even harder. Back with our group, they successfully obtained one of the 6 jewels known as the Crimson Blossom. This jewel holds immense magical power and will help them locate the other jewels. Alysseret wanted to be the one to activate the jewel, but everyone agreed not to let her do it because she tends to exaggerate everything. In the end, Mizet activated it, and a map of a large city appeared before them. The city was Heractopia, where massive battles took place in the Colosseum. The story goes that King Alexander, who built the Colosseum 400 years ago, participated in 10,000 fights unarmed, using only his body. Alexander was known as the undefeated champion, and people from all over the world came to watch or challenge him. This small kingdom thrived and is now known as Heractopia. When Rick and his group arrived in the kingdom, they saw a statue of Alexander, who would never return to this kingdom. Brufston, known as the king of boxing, looked at the place with great interest. Fighting for entertainment was a big deal here, and being a boxer was a popular job. Brufston wished he could have fought King Alexander at least once in his life, but Rick was worried they might cause trouble in the kingdom. They tried to gather information about the 6 jewels, but people seemed scared of the giant-sized Brufston. Suddenly, they spotted a bald man harassing a girl. Brufston decided to question the man, but instead, the man challenged Brufston to a fight in the alley. Brufston accepted the challenge and easily defeated him. The man's name was Gold, and the girl was named Militia. They offered to answer any questions the group had. Rick showed them the Crimson Blossom and asked if there were any similar jewels in the kingdom. They were amazed by the jewel's magic and mentioned they had seen something like it before but couldn't remember where. Rick pleaded with them to think harder. However, at that moment, the announcement for the King of Fists tournament echoed. This tournament is an annual event to determine the boxing champion, attracting over 500,000 visitors each year. A boxer named Kelvin, who has won the last 3 tournaments in a row, is the main attraction. It turns out, the Jewel R group is searching for a set on Kelvin's championship belt. Kelvin thanked his supporters and explained to his coach that his job as a boxer is to create excitement leading up to the tournament. Although the coach knew Kelvin wasn't fully recovered, Kelvin was still eager to find a worthy opponent. Rick then entered the gym and explained that they were looking for a particular jewel. Brufston got straight to the point, surprising Kelvin with his presence. Rick clarified that they were not thieves, but Brufston wanted to take the belt and exchange it for an equivalent jewel. Kelvin refused to hand over his belt, as it represented the pride of the people of Heractopia. The only way to get the belt was by winning the King of Fists tournament. Brufston agreed, and the group left the venue. The coach wondered why Kelvin let them go so easily. Kelvin explained that fighting Rick and his group would result in death. The coach was shocked by their strength, and Kelvin felt they possessed extraordinary skills despite appearing ordinary. Brufston then decided that his new plan was to become a boxer and win the King of Fists tournament. To participate, they had to go through several preliminary rounds in the eastern or western side of the kingdom and win against those who qualified. Brufston chose to compete in the Eastern League and ordered Rick to enter through the west. Rick wondered if Brufston could handle everything on his own. Brufston explained that he had already arranged for a guide, and it turned out that this guide was highly valuable. Meanwhile, Rionette informed Rick that he had to pass the test before becoming a boxer. This test was famous worldwide as the Path to Glory, and Rick thought it sounded exciting. The first test was a mock physical fight, where the opponent was chosen at random. This time, Rick's opponent was a promising rookie who had won all the preliminary round matches of the tournament. Although winning or losing wasn't too important, participants still had to meet certain standards to pass. Rick was surprised when he heard his opponent's voice. It turned out to be Angelica. Angelica appeared very confident, but her expression changed to shock when she saw Rick. Around them, a small swirl of excitement predicted that Angelica would quickly defeat Rick. Angelica was actually worried because her opponent was someone who had previously defeated her A-rank brother. Although victory wasn't crucial at that moment, Angelica was determined not to lose in this mock fight. Rick didn't seem too intimidating to her, but Angelica was determined not to repeat her past mistakes. As soon as the test began, Angelica put in her best effort from the start. She launched a powerful attack but suddenly fell to the ground. Angelica thought she just lost her balance, but she fell again. Rick stood over her, asking what she thought of the new skills he had learned in the past few months. Angelica was stunned to realize that Rick had knocked her down, and Rick revealed that the technique was called the 8 Secrets of Easing. The first secret was to sweep the opponent's legs to demoralize them. Angelica felt horrified because Rick had swept her legs so swiftly that even a second-class knight wouldn't have seen it. She tried to create some distance, but Rick kept knocking her down. Although Angelica didn't give up, Rick eventually decided to fight seriously, and Angelica finally conceded. With that, Rick became a boxer and was ready for the qualifying rounds. However, Angelica stopped him and asked how many times he planned to humiliate her. Not wanting to make her cry, Rick offered to have a meal together. Since the restaurant was owned by Melicia's parents, Melicia told Angelica to relax and enjoy some free food. Angelica was shocked to hear that Rick planned to win the King of Fists tournament. For Angelica, who had only become a boxer 4 months ago, it felt like a crazy dream that Rick wanted to win the tournament this year. Angelica acknowledged that Rick's strength defied logic, but she was convinced he couldn't win. She explained that the path to the King of Fists tournament was long. To participate in the league competition, one had to win 40 fights during the 6-month preliminaries. Rick thought it sounded easy, but it turned out to be extremely brutal. There was only 1 week left, and winning 40 matches in such a short time was physically impossible. Rick was shocked to hear this because he thought that 10 fights a day would be easy. He requested to finish 40 fights in 4 days, which horrified Angelica. She hoped Rick would stop pushing the limits of common sense. The next day, Rick started his first preliminary fight against Grit. Grit was known for the rumor that he used weapons, although no evidence was found during the body check. Rick was advised to be careful. As the fight began, Rick was happy to see that Grit wasn't carrying any weapons. However, Grit had hidden a stone that boosted his attack power by 30 times. The fight started, and Grit used his cloak to obstruct Rick's vision. His attacks were strong, and Grit claimed his victory. However, he felt pain in his broken arm. Rick revealed the impact stone that Grit had used, explaining that it could break bones if it didn't hit hard enough. Grit thought about his training, but it was too late when Rick took his turn to attack. The essence of the 8 secrets was to win the fight without causing major injury to the opponent. Grit fainted, and Rick was announced as the winner. A man was impressed by Rick's strength, and was sure that this year's tournament would be unforgettable. Elsewhere, some terrifying monsters began to reveal themselves, and they were told that the time to start working was getting closer. Meanwhile, Angelica was competing in her own match and easily annihilated her opponent. Rick congratulated Angelica on her success in getting through the preliminaries and bragged about his victory in 40 consecutive matches. He also intended to dominate the block league, and he was very excited to do his best. Angelica still couldn't believe that Rick actually planned to do 40 fights in 4 days. Considering that each place only held 1 match per day, this meant Rick would have to travel a long distance between preliminary fights. Angelica felt this was nearly impossible. Rick had to get to Green Hill Arena within 10 minutes before the next match, but Angelica felt frustrated because Rick wasn't listening. The arena was 30 kilometers away, and even with a train, Rick wouldn't be able to make it on time. Rick thought the suggestion to take the slow train was crazy and preferred to just run. Angelica wanted to watch Rick's match, but it was impossible for her to arrive on time. Rionette believed that Rick could make it, so she used her high-speed parkour skills. At the fight venue, Rick had already finished competing, but Angelica wasn't in good shape to see it. Rick won, but he needed to keep practicing his 8 secrets to avoid causing too much damage to his opponents. The 3 of them moved from one arena to another, with Rick taking down his opponents one by one. 4 days passed, and Angelica was amazed that Rick actually managed to win the 40 matches needed for the preliminaries. Angelica noticed how active Rick was and felt sorry for Rionette, who was always with him. There were rumors that they might be in love. Strangely, Rionette didn't seem to mind, and she revealed that she had deep feelings for Rick. On the other hand, Rick finished running and met the chairman of the Western League Management Committee, Snape, who was impressed with Rick's speed and called it the fastest qualification time in the league's preliminary history. Snape, who was known as a former boxer, revealed that he retired at the age of 23 after winning a small competition. Despite his retirement, he was still involved in this year's competition as the main sponsor. Snape asked Rick to say hi to Angelica and also warned him not to get too excited. After that, Melicia expressed her concern because Snape was from the Dragonaut Company. There were rumors that Snape was involved with the underworld, and he was the main sponsor of this year's competition. In the midst of all that, Rick overheard some men talking about this year's bunnies, whom they referred to as the Dark Fairy Girls. The next day, Angelica and Rionette appeared as the bunnies, helping to build excitement for the tournament and accepting bets. Rionette agreed to do it because Angelica did, and Angelica felt she couldn't refuse someone asking for help with blood on their face. All the bunnies felt uncomfortable, but Angelica paid the price for being too close to Angelica. She felt extremely embarrassed when Rick showed up, and she tried to explain that she was just helping someone. Rick was amazed by how great Rionette looked, and Angelica became upset because he didn't react the same way toward her. Meanwhile, the old gym leader read the news about how Rick had impressively passed the preliminary round in just 2 days, with each of his matches ending in a one-punch KO. His performance caught the attention of many, but Kelvin also managed to pass into the Western League in just 4 days. Kelvin, known as the greedy wolf of the slums, had just destroyed a group of his friends and asked the old man to clean up the mess. However, the old man refused and explained that he was there to scout Kelvin and bring him back to Heractopia, a place where Kelvin could get anything by fighting and winning. Initially uninterested, Kelvin finally agreed to go after learning that Heractopia had many strong fighters. Amid all the chaos, Angelica was still upset because Rick didn't seem to notice her in the way she had hoped. Rick, seemingly unconcerned, changed the subject and mentioned that Snape was looking for her. Angelica appeared surprised, but she quickly denied knowing anyone by that name. The next day, the Block League competition to determine who would participate in the final tournament began. Only one participant from each block could advance, so the competition was bound to be fierce. Angelica faced off against the woman, and Rick could sense that Angelica didn't seem like herself. Despite the tension, Angelica managed to secure the victory. It was Rick's turn next. He used one of his 8 secrets to easily defeat his opponent. Rionette was happy to see Rick getting better at controlling himself, but Angelica still thought he was as ridiculous as ever. Both of them continued winning their fights until only 4 matches remained. Rick wanted to discuss tactics since every match needed to be won, but Angelica felt she didn't need it. She prepared for her next opponent. Rick was impressed by how Angelica combined physical techniques and magic. However, something seemed dangerous about her opponent. The man managed to break through Angelica's magic and delivered a devastating blow. Rick feared Angelica would suffer serious damage, and sure enough, it was announced that Angelica had lost. Angelica felt crushed, both physically and in terms of her pride. Despite fighting hard, the man named Taylor had destroyed her with a single punch. Even though Angelica was healed, she still felt deeply shaken. Rick tried to encourage her, saying she could win if she focused more. Angelica began to sense something was bothering her, and Rick wanted to help, even though Angelica herself wasn't sure of her chances. Rick's words finally made Angelica reveal that Snape was her fiancé. Angelica explained that a year ago, her parents died in an accident, leaving her and her siblings to take on the household responsibilities. Unfortunately, they faced major financial struggles. Their grandfather made a deal with Snape, who promised to give a large sum of money if he was allowed to marry Angelica. Rick looked shocked at this news, and Angelica was annoyed by his delayed reaction. Angelica continued her story, explaining that her efforts to stop the marriage led her to discover that Snape was the main sponsor of the tournament. Before she could reveal Snape's true intentions, they were interrupted by a commotion outside. They found a dragon man rampaging and causing trouble, and they encountered Taylor, the one who had previously defeated Angelica. Taylor tried to stop the dragon from harming a woman, but the dragon crushed him with a single blow. A servant attempted to calm the dragon, but became the target of its rage instead. Angelica tried to de-escalate the situation, but the dragon grew even angrier. Rick then surprised everyone by stepping forward and calmly asking the dragon to settle down. Just then, Snape arrived and stopped the dragon, named Geese. Snape asked Geese to keep things under control during the tournament and apologized to the bar owner, explaining that Geese was his brother. Snape also mentioned that no one was strong enough to fight Geese, and that Geese could be a bit troublesome when he acted rough. Snape looked at Angelica and was relieved to see she wasn't hurt. After Snape left, Angelica explained more about her relationship with Snape and the tournament. Snape had promised to give her family money, but it turned out that his company didn't have enough to pay. This made Angelica realize that Snape intended to earn money through the tournament. Rick figured out that Snape would use his sponsor slot to manipulate the tournament's results, and Angelica confirmed this. Determined to win the tournament to prevent Snape from upholding his part of the deal and to cancel the engagement, Angelica realized that Geese would be a major challenge she had to face. When Rick offered to train her, Angelica initially felt scared. Rick explained that the training would be harder than anything Angelica had ever imagined, but she had to do it without hesitation. Angelica was shocked when Rick started adding weights to her and only told her to remember her reinforcement magic to avoid dying. Angelica wished Rick would explain the training first, but he ignored her pleas and simply dragged her along while running. Angelica felt confused and scared, but Rick explained that her body would get used to fast movements if she was pulled by someone faster. Even though her acceleration was good, Angelica lost her stability. Rick reassured her that the training wouldn't be too bad because there were only 6 hours left. After everything was over, Angelica could hardly believe that her legs were still attached to her body. She honestly thought they had fallen off long ago. Rick, on the other hand, had gone through the exact same training and had even died 3 times on the first day. Even though Angelica felt proud for surviving, Rick informed her that afternoon training would begin after their lunch break. Angelica nearly cried, begging for it to end, but Rick didn't seem to care much and simply said they'd meet again in an hour. After 5 exhausting days of training, Angelica tried to convince herself that she wasn't running away, but merely making a tactical retreat for the sake of her mental health. Angelica was absolutely sure Rick wouldn't find her, but she was completely wrong. Rick searched the entire country for her, even though Angelica had only been hiding for 15 minutes. Rick calmly explained that he understood why she ran away, since he had done the same during his 2 years of training. Rick escaped dozens of times and died thousands of times. Elissaret even had to share mana with Brufston to revive Rick 2,000 times. That made Rick get used to the training and even death. Rick almost gave up several times, but Brufston always encouraged him. Angelica then opened up about all the things she hated about being a noble and expressed her desire to contribute to her family as a warrior, not as a noblewoman. Angelica aspired to become the first special class female knight, and she didn't want to feel heavy regret. With newfound determination, Angelica was ready to train again. Angelica was better suited to using a sword, but the tournament didn't allow weapons. So, Rick decided to teach her a technique that could turn her hands into swords. For that, Rick invited Rionette to join their training. When the final match for the top position in Block C began, Angelica looked different. She growled like a wild beast. The audience realized that her elegant fighting style might not be effective against this opponent, but there was something very different about her. The fight started, and everyone was shocked to see her attack with wild energy, securing an immediate victory. Rick was pleased with the results of the training, but Angelica seemed like she was in some sort of trance. Afterward, Mizet returned with disappointing news from the orb he was searching for. There were no new leads. Mizet attempted to approach the servant, but was rejected. That night, Brufston explained to Mizet that they would get another orb if they won the tournament. Elissaret also wanted to join, but Rick thought it would be better for her to wait. Angelica was worried that Elissaret might destroy the entire place if she fought. Rick explained that he had trained Angelica, but she was frustrated because there wasn't enough time for more practice. Everyone encouraged Angelica to do her best. Even Elissaret gave her support, despite not fully understanding the situation. The next day, the King's Fist tournament began. The first match was announced, revealing who would fight: Rick, Angelica, and Geese. Rick was relieved that he didn't have to face Brufston because he felt he would lose immediately. Brufston fought a fish-like man, while his bald friend cheered him on. Kelvin was also there, and someone in the audience was worried about his condition. Cyclops believed Kelvin would win no matter his condition. The audience began betting on who would win, but Angelica had already noticed something. Geese was placed in a bracket where he wouldn't have to face Brufston or Kelvin until the finals. The match was set up to make Geese look incredibly strong, and Snape would bet against Angelica's opponent. With the odds stacked against Angelica, Snape would bet big, and Geese would lose on purpose to give Snape a huge payoff. Angelica was determined to ruin that plan. When the first match started, Geese's opponent looked helpless. The opponent asked Geese to take the fight seriously, but Geese shocked everyone with his overwhelming strength in a single swing. His opponent launched a quick attack, but Geese only grew more annoyed. Geese struck again and accidentally knocked his opponent out, being declared the winner. Everyone was curious about this powerful sponsored fighter, but Rick sensed something odd. Despite his strength, Geese's movements looked amateurish. Still, Geese easily won and left a strong impression on the audience. The tournament continued, and our heroes really put on a stellar performance, winning all their matches. The final match of the first round featured Kelvin, whom everyone was eager to watch. Kelvin, with his incredible speed, seemed to know exactly what his opponent would do. Rick observed all of this and thought Kelvin had truly mastered the game. Brufston explained how unique Kelvin was. Kelvin could sense changes in electrical signals and adrenaline just by smelling them. Everyone agreed that Kelvin was an incredible fighter, but the crowd was truly shocked when Kelvin suddenly collapsed to the ground. Rick was also surprised, especially after hearing that Kelvin had actually let himself get hit. When Kelvin stood back up and quickly knocked out his opponent, the audience cheered enthusiastically. Even though Kelvin was declared the winner, his friends felt he was playing around too much. The second round began the next day, and the atmosphere grew more intense. Snape sat next to Rick, introducing himself to the others. Elissaret was curious why Snape was acting so friendly, and Rick wondered why Snape wasn't sitting in the VIP seats. Snape explained that the next match was very important. It was between his brother and his fiancée, so Snape needed to see it up close. In the hallway, Geese was reflecting on how much he drank the night before and how he met Angelica. Angelica had to be reminded of who Geese was, and Geese explained that Snape had forbidden him from damaging his face so it would still look good for their wedding. Angelica wanted to show the results of her hard work, but Geese mocked her, saying no amount of training could cover the gap in their strength. Angelica was confident that she had trained hard too, but Geese called himself a natural talent and suggested Angelica stay quiet during their fight. This, of course, made Angelica furious, and she swore to crush Geese. When their match began, the crowd went wild. However, Angelica was shocked when her first attack had no effect on Geese. Geese dodged her moves, and even her next hit, which landed directly, didn't faze him. Angelica realized that basic attacks wouldn't hurt Geese, so she did something that completely surprised Snape in the stands. Angelica released her reinforcement magic, and Geese started getting curious about what Angelica was planning. With support from Rionette, Angelica used Mana Reflex Inversion. Though Geese told her to give up, Angelica unleashed a new thread-cutting strike. This attack finally managed to wound Geese, and the crowd roared with excitement. Feeling satisfied, Angelica wondered who Geese had been calling a child after all. Snape was silent for a moment, surprised that even the sharpest sword couldn't scratch Geese's skin. Rick and Rionette already knew about this since they were the ones who taught Angelica the technique. A flashback showed the moment Rionette demonstrated the technique to Angelica. The technique was called Thread Slash. Although Angelica had briefly thought Rick had turned into a psychopath for forcing her to learn such a dangerous move, Rionette calmly explained that the technique wasn't impossible to master, considering Rick himself had managed to learn it. After going through a long and exhausting process, Angelica eventually succeeded in combining her other abilities and perfected the technique in her own style. With her Flicker Feet ability, Angelica was able to use the technique in a way that only she could. Geese began to feel uneasy as Angelica used the move again, almost slicing his body in half. While Snape watched with a small smile on his face, enjoying the intense battle between Angelica and Geese, Geese began to lose his patience. With a quick motion, Geese slammed Angelica into the wall, then turned to Snape and said that he couldn't help but do whatever he wanted to such a spirited opponent like Angelica. Angelica refused to give up, but Geese had started to adapt to her Flicker Feet ability, which had appeared several times. Now Geese could match Angelica's speed. This time, Geese truly landed a hard hit on her and laughed at her efforts. Rionette also had the Flicker Feet ability, but Geese mocked her, saying that it only made her an average fighter. Rick, on the other hand, began to worry about Angelica's condition. However, Snape felt pleased, as Rick was finally realizing just how powerful Geese truly was. Snape first met his foster brother when Geese was only 8 years old. Back then, Geese defeated Snape so thoroughly that Snape couldn't even stand. It turned out that Geese was the reason Snape decided to retire from fighting. Geese was a prodigy, born with all the natural talent needed for combat, a true monster. On top of that, Geese was incredibly annoying, constantly insulting Angelica. Geese said that Angelica was useless trash who would never change, no matter how hard she trained. He didn't even hesitate to insult Angelica's parents, causing her blood to boil even more. Snape knew that Angelica thought she was trying to orchestrate Geese's defeat in this fight, but that wasn't necessary. Geese's strength was far too overwhelming to need such tactics. Instead, Snape did the opposite. He allowed Geese to fully showcase his true power. As the match started, the crowd watched in horror as Geese ruthlessly pummeled Angelica. It wasn't just a normal fight, it was a brutal beating. Even Rick felt that Angelica had reached her limit. Despite this, Angelica remained confident that Geese wouldn't be able to defeat her. However, Geese was determined to see her crushed. He wanted Angelica to realize that no amount of training could ever allow a piece of trash like her to defeat a prodigy like him. Angelica didn't want to leave any regrets behind, as she once told Rick, so she decided to try one final strike. Unfortunately, this only fueled Geese's desire to finish her off. Rick tried to stop the match, but it was too late as Geese launched his final attack. Luckily, something caused Geese's attack to miss, saving Angelica's life, but Geese was still declared the winner. After the match, Geese realized that it was Rick who had thrown a shoe at him, but Rick looked furious. Angelica was immediately taken away for treatment, while Rick met Geese in the hallway. Geese, still upset about the interference, tried to attack Rick. However, Geese was shocked when Rick easily dodged his strike. Rick calmly said that there was no need to rush because he wanted to defeat Geese in front of everyone. Geese looked incredibly angry, but deep down, he felt the same. In the next match, Rick won, but Angelica was still in a terrible condition. Seeing Angelica, Rick remembered how hard she had trained, and he couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. Meanwhile, Brufston easily defeated his opponent with just one strike, similar to what Rick had done. Kelvin also didn't hold back, displaying his immense strength. As a result, only 4 competitors remained, with the semifinals set to take place the following day. Rick finished some training and found that Angelica had started to recover. He suspected that it was Brufston who healed her, but Brufston warned that the damage deep inside her body might still be there. Angelica seemed bothered by something, but Rick didn't notice, so Angelica directly explained what was wrong. Rick kept training her even though nothing was wrong, but in the end, the training failed. Angelica apologized for wasting Rick's time and explained that she just wanted to prove that she could stand on her own 2 feet. Angelica had briefly tried to convince herself that marrying Snape might not be so bad, but Rick managed to make her realize the truth. Rick said that it was actually him who should apologize for not recognizing Geese's true strength before it was too late. Rick then suggested that Angelica carefully watch the next match so she could see what lay beyond the limits of the training they had gone through. The semifinals finally began, and Rick was ready to face Geese. Rick was briefly surprised when he heard Geese wanted to apologize to Angelica, but it turned out to be just small talk. Geese only regretted not ending Angelica's life when he had the chance. Now, Angelica had to live with the frustration of her own inability. The fight started, and Geese immediately began mocking Rick. But this time, Rick didn't remain passive. He struck Geese hard in the face, knocking him down. Geese, usually unbeatable, now knelt before Rick, looking pathetic. Rick told him to stop acting pathetic and fight seriously. Geese thought Rick was being overly confident, but before he could react, Rick hit him again with a powerful blow. Angelica, watching from the sidelines, looked shocked. Rick's attacks were effective on Geese's steel-like body, but surprisingly, Rick wasn't even using his full strength. Rick only used measured and controlled strikes. The power of his punches didn't impact the outer part of Geese's body, but instead penetrated inside, damaging from within. No matter how strong Geese's body was, if Rick struck at the right time, the damage would be immense. Rick gave Geese the chance to surrender, but Geese chose to use a special body-enhancing magic meant for dragons. The battle became even more intense. The technique consumed a lot of magic energy, but Geese didn't care. It was as if he had an endless supply of energy. Snape, watching from afar, explained that Geese had never trained his magic capacity at all. Geese was simply born with an extraordinary amount of magical energy. Rick was basically the opposite of Geese, so Geese told him to blame his parents for that. When Rick launched his next attack, Geese managed to block it with his iron body, surprising Angelica to see Geese mastering the technique Rick had been using. The audience, who had been excited earlier, now started to grow quiet, and Geese assumed everyone was bored of watching a genius crush an ordinary person. Rick continued his rant, saying he didn't care about the audience. What he cared about was how Angelica saw him. Rick deflected another attack and seemed satisfied as he noticed Geese starting to show signs of fatigue. Geese was shocked. No matter how hard Geese struck, Rick never shed a single drop of blood. It turned out that Rick was using a special technique that allowed him to spread the impact of the attacks throughout his body, barely taking any damage at all. Geese felt insulted, thinking Rick was holding back. Rick then explained that he was deliberately adjusting his physical strength to match Angelica's level. Winning wasn't the only goal. Rick wanted to show Angelica his potential and make her realize what could truly be achieved. Rick had turned this fight into a sort of virtual rematch between Geese and Angelica. Of course, this only made Geese angrier. But Rick calmly told him to focus and think about his next move. As Geese prepared his body for the next attack, Rick hit his armor with full force, shattering it into pieces. Meanwhile, Snape struggled to believe that Rick could surpass Geese in terms of strength. However, Rick's team confirmed that Rick had almost no special abilities. Rick had only started training seriously after his magic practice time ran out, so technically, Rick was still below average. Rick told Geese that he wasn't used to feeling tired, so his attacks were starting to lose accuracy. People who keep pushing through exhaustion, those who don't stop moving until they physically can't anymore, that's true strength. Meanwhile, Geese, his mind starting to spiral, kept attacking, but it was all in vain. Rick explained that a true genius is someone who sharpens their skills through hard work. Rick had seen this in his friends. As for Geese, he always thought he was the strongest, but in reality, Geese had only faced easy opponents. Geese completely lost his composure after hearing this. He unleashed his ultimate move, the most powerful Dragonite enhancement magic, transforming Geese into something almost dragon-like. Snape explained that Geese had summoned the blood of an ancient dragon. Rick was shocked by this power, and even more surprised when his next attack had no effect at all. Now, Geese seemed to be made of metal, and his movements were much faster. Geese felt satisfied that Rick had finally realized his strength, but what Rick actually meant was that, at Angelica's current level, it would be impossible for Rick to defeat a dragon. However, that didn't mean Angelica should give up. She just needed to keep training until she was ready to risk her life again in the future. Rick unleashed the result of 12 months of intense training, moving too fast to be seen. With this speed, Rick used the dragon's power to defeat Geese. Angelica admitted she wasn't at that level yet, but she could see Rick using an advanced flashing foot technique. This made her realize that if she continued her brutal training for another year, she might also be able to reach this level of strength. Having already mastered the fight, Rick started lecturing again. He explained that ordinary hard work couldn't overcome the difference in natural abilities. It takes extraordinary perseverance to keep pushing oneself to the highest limits. Meanwhile, Rick unleashed his finishing move, striking Geese so hard that he was sent flying. Rick wondered if this lizard had what it took to keep pushing himself through this struggle. Unfortunately, Geese didn't learn anything from all of this, so Rick decided to end the fight quickly. He used the thread slash attack, although it wasn't as precise as Angelica's. Still, the attack was enough to defeat Geese. Rick then told Geese that he was lucky not to have to face Angelica a year from now, when she'd be much stronger. Angelica was confident that she could reach the level Rick had shown within a year. Meanwhile, Rick declared himself the winner of the fight. Strangely, Snape seemed unusually calm, even though he was going through inner turmoil. Deep down, Snape was actually pleased to see Geese lose so badly. Snape had his reasons. Geese had ruined his life as a boxer, so Snape didn't feel any sympathy at all. Plus, Snape had lost a lot of money betting on Geese and had also missed out on marrying Angelica. Angelica had even teased him about it, but she was surprised when Snape accepted this loss gracefully. Now, it was time for the second match of the tournament, which pitted Brufston against Kelvin. Kelvin was a 3-time champion, but Brufston had knocked out all his opponents with just one punch. From the way Brufston stood, Kelvin already knew he was up against a beast, but Kelvin still didn't give him any opening. The fight began, and Kelvin immediately launched a barrage of punches. The audience was stunned as Brufston easily pushed Kelvin back. Instead of being discouraged, Kelvin grew even more excited, finally facing the strongest opponent he had ever encountered. But everyone suddenly fell silent in horror when Geese returned to the arena out of nowhere. His dragon blood had driven him mad, and Geese began rampaging through the stands. Geese, now a terrifying monster, attacked Kelvin right away. However, Kelvin effortlessly stopped and threw him aside. While Geese's power was at an A-rank level, Kelvin defeated him like it was nothing. This made everyone wonder if Kelvin had already reached S rank. Kelvin was a bit disappointed when he learned that his match would be postponed until the next day, but Brufston mentioned that he sensed some uncertainty in Kelvin's attacks. After that, everyone went out to eat together and discuss strategies. They only needed either Brufston or Rick to win, and then they could get the gem. Rick wasn't there though, as he was running 700 kilometers. Yep. Rick was still running, and Angelica wasn't surprised at all by his strange behavior. Rick ran so far that he ended up outside the city and accidentally came across Kelvin, who was training. Rick thought that Kelvin should be saving his energy for the match against Brufston. But it turned out that Kelvin didn't care about that. Instead, Kelvin challenged Rick to a fight. Rick had no choice but to accept, and Kelvin was shocked by Rick's insane speed. Rick, in turn, was impressed that Kelvin could dodge his punches. Rick started to wonder why Kelvin had even taken a hit in the previous tournament. Kelvin acknowledged Rick's strength and decided to share a bit about his past. Ever since he was a child, Kelvin had always been waiting for the next fight, but eventually, there was no one left who could match him. When he arrived in Heractopia, things improved slightly because there were plenty of strong fighters there. In the end, though, Kelvin found himself back at the top. Kelvin started to feel bored with fights that no longer held any meaning. One day, someone complained to Fury that people were getting tired of the tournaments because Kelvin always won with a single punch. That person warned that if things continued like this, Fury's gym could go bankrupt because no one would be interested in the fights anymore. The person suggested that Kelvin should start pretending to lose so the audience wouldn't get bored. Kelvin, not wanting to cause trouble for Fury, who had already lost one eye, finally agreed to stage his fights as if he could be defeated. From then on, Kelvin began mixing up his performances. Sometimes, Kelvin fought poorly, but other times he fought well. His only goal was to make the fights more exciting for the audience. Even so, Kelvin still managed to win 3 times in a row. Now, Kelvin wasn't fighting to win but to make the battles more entertaining. Kelvin never fought with his full strength. Thanks to the excitement of his matches, many spectators came to the city, and Fury's gym began to thrive. While Kelvin was telling this story, Rick seemed like he wasn't really paying attention. Instead, Rick warned Kelvin not to underestimate Brufston. The next day, the fight began, and the audience was informed that the seating area was protected by defensive magic. The fight started similarly to the previous one, but this time, Kelvin showcased a new technique he hadn't used before. Everyone was shocked to see Kelvin spinning his arm at lightning speed, like thunder, to increase the power of his punches. The move was enough to knock Brufston's arm down, but Brufston almost eliminated Kelvin with a quick counterattack. Kelvin was impressed, but Brufston couldn't say the same. Brufston knew that Kelvin wasn't fighting seriously. Deep down, Kelvin wondered if Rick had leaked this secret. Brufston was just guessing, while Kelvin admitted that he was holding back for the sake of the audience. Kelvin realized that Brufston was indeed strong, but Kelvin still couldn't fight at his full potential. If he did, everyone would surely notice that Kelvin had been holding back and staging the fights. Despite feeling a bit embarrassed, Brufston praised him for thinking of others more than himself. Kelvin then prepared to use the appropriate amount of strength for the situation. Brufston casually said that he would fight using only 2 fingers and wouldn't move from his spot. Not wanting to be a hypocrite, Kelvin accepted Brufston's challenge. With just 2 fingers, Brufston lightly tossed Kelvin, and Brufston realized the fight was getting more interesting. The crowd erupted in cheers for Kelvin, but Mizet knew that Bruffston was up to something clever. Kelvin kept thinking about how exciting it would be to face someone like Bruffston with all of his strength, especially since there were so many moves Kelvin wanted to try. Unfortunately, Kelvin didn't want to ruin everything. At that moment, Nick Fury shouted his name, immediately catching Kelvin's attention. Fury knew that Kelvin had been holding back, and Fury said it had always been his dream to train the strongest boxer in history. Fury wanted Kelvin to become the strongest, but Kelvin began to wonder if that was really okay. The old man didn't want anything else, so Kelvin decided to fight with all his heart. Feeling more excited than ever, Kelvin told Bruffston that there was no need to hold back anymore. The audience was shocked when Bruffston managed to stop Kelvin's brutal attack, but Kelvin pointed out that Bruffston had to use all 5 fingers to block him. Kelvin thought it might have just been a coincidence, but Bruffston explained that he was only using the right amount of strength. Bruffston kept blocking all of Kelvin's attacks, but Kelvin began to notice some openings. When Kelvin was finally thrown back, he quickly adjusted his body to soften the impact of his fall. The two fighters were locked in a fierce exchange, while the audience slowly realized that Kelvin had been deceiving them all along. There was no turning back now, so Kelvin was determined to see this fight through to the end. Kelvin used level 5 nature magic, but Angelica scoffed, saying someone like Kelvin shouldn't be good at magic. This meant Kelvin must have trained himself to his limit multiple times. Everyone was shocked, and Fury reflected on how foolish he felt for not even knowing that Kelvin could use magic. Bruffston blocked the attack, but Kelvin closed in, ready for the next spell. Kelvin managed to dodge Bruffston's strike and trap the big man. Angelica expected something extraordinary from Kelvin, but Rick was starting to worry. Kelvin prepared for his next spell, but Bruffston's team seemed relaxed. However, the crowd was stunned when Kelvin began using level 8 magic. Kelvin created a massive energy ball, and Rick immediately panicked, realizing how bad the situation was. Angelica had never seen Rick in such a state before and simply remarked that Kelvin was much stronger than Rick had imagined. But the most frightening part was that this meant Bruffston would stop holding back. Bruffston managed to break free from the trap and declared that Kelvin needed to brace for the next attack. The massive energy ball Kelvin created kept growing, but everyone was shocked when Bruffston used sheer brute strength to stop it. Bruffston acknowledged Kelvin's newfound fighting spirit, and the crowd gasped when Bruffston gave a quarter thumbs up. This was an orc tradition, signifying that both fighters would abandon dodging and defense in favor of direct blows. Rick was horrified at the implication, knowing that Bruffston would now only focus on attacking for the remainder of the fight. Meanwhile, Kelvin felt something he had never experienced before and began wondering if this feeling was what people call terror. Kelvin tried various types of level 7 magic, but none of them worked. Bruffston kept advancing without even blinking. Everyone started to believe that Kelvin had run out of energy after casting so many spells, and Bruffston finally landed a punch. Angelica thought it was a direct hit, but Rick explained that wasn't exactly the case. Kelvin used several maneuvers to avoid complete destruction. His bones and organs were still badly damaged, but anyone else might have died by now. Kelvin briefly considered giving up, but he had always longed for an opponent like Bruffston. Even though Kelvin was out of magic, he refused to surrender, firmly stating that he still had his physical strength. Kelvin launched a flurry of punches, but Rick knew all too well that Kelvin wouldn't last long after taking so much damage. Eventually, Kelvin passed out, shocked to realize that someone as strong as Bruffston existed in this world. At that moment, the crowd began cheering for Kelvin. Kelvin was moved by their cheers, even after deceiving them for so long, and he pushed himself to stand up again. The audience went wild as Kelvin prepared for his final strike. Although Kelvin was out of both magic and energy, he revealed that this was the moment to carve his own soul as fuel. Surrounded by flames, Kelvin focused on calming his spirit. However, all those efforts were pretty much in vain, as Kelvin's incredible attack had no effect on Bruffston. Instead, Bruffston complimented the impressive strike and wondered if Kelvin had given everything he had. Kelvin could only laugh, realizing that he couldn't even budge Bruffston. But Kelvin genuinely said that this was the most enjoyable fight he had ever experienced in his life. Kelvin finally earned Bruffston's respect, and Bruffston showed it by landing a punch right to Kelvin's face. As Kelvin passed out and fell, he was still smiling, feeling the thrill of the battle he had just fought. Bruffston's friends cheered in celebration of their victory, while Rick didn't want to be left out and congratulated Bruffston for defeating the champion. But Bruffston himself admitted that Kelvin was truly impressive. Rick felt pleased, thinking they had surely found a new gem, and all Rick had to do was guide him. However, Bruffston interrupted the conversation and firmly stated that he was looking forward to their next match. Rick then realized that he was in a dangerous situation, even losing a lot of hair due to excessive stress. Elsewhere, Kelvin was reading an article about his defeat and how Kelvin had deceived everyone. Kelvin felt as though he had become the villain, but Fury reassured him that everything would be fine. Fury was actually more interested in Kelvin's final move because Fury had never known that Kelvin had such a powerful attack in his arsenal. Kelvin explained that the move had just emerged because Kelvin was so immersed in the moment. Kelvin felt guilty for lying to everyone, and even worse because he ultimately lost. Brufston confirmed that Kelvin lost, but Brufston also said that losing wasn't a big deal. Brufston reassured Kelvin that Kelvin could train harder and become even stronger. Kelvin wondered why Brufston cared so much about him. Fury then explained that Brufston saw Kelvin like his own child. Brufston then interrupted, offering to heal Kelvin's wounds. Kelvin refused the offer to be healed because Kelvin wanted to feel the pain that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Kelvin also realized that Rick was right when he warned him about how strong Brufston was. Meanwhile, Rick wasn't feeling okay. Rick locked himself in his room and was still reluctant to fight again. Angelica tried to encourage him, telling him to stop acting like a child, but Rick remained firm. Rick didn't want to experience death again. Everyone had already gathered for the finals, but now Snape seemed to be in a hurry. Snape came to give a little push, but more importantly, Snape needed to convince Rick to come out of hiding. Snape, full of energy, tried to see everything as an opportunity. Snape really wanted Rick to participate, but Rick firmly responded that his life was more important than any tournament. Snape replied that there was no other way. If Rick didn't want to risk his life, then everyone else would have to give up their dreams too. Angelica, not wanting to back down, reminded Rick that Rick could be revived, so death shouldn't be a big deal. It was easy for her to say, but Rick responded seriously, "Death is terrifying." Angelica tried to convince him again, reminding Rick that Rick had trained for years with Brufston. Rick shouldn't be afraid to fight just one match against Brufston. However, Rick explained that training and actual fighting were very different, and Angelica wouldn't understand. Angelica felt hurt by these words, and in that moment, Angelica realized that Angelica had been wrong about Rick all along. On the other hand, Mizet started to wonder how strange this all was. Brufston had apparently set up a perfect training plan from the very first day he arrived. Rick thought they were only preparing to train any allies they met to defeat Kaiser El Sepia. However, that wasn't the only reason. Mizet explained that Brufston had always been waiting for the chance to train someone who could match Brufston equally. The orc background was indeed full of fighting culture, but Brufston was so strong that Brufston had never been involved in a single fight. Since childhood, Brufston felt lonely, and it had been his dream to one day fight someone as an equal. Mizet believed that Brufston hoped the fight with Rick could fulfill that wish, so Mizet wanted Rick to consider it. Elissaret then shared her opinion, and Rick began to ponder it. Rick remembered the first time he met Brufston, where Rick felt terrified. Just from their handshake, Brufston could already sense that Rick had no intention of fighting, even with minimal experience and the lowest magic capacity. Rick thought Brufston was the same as everyone else who mocked him, thinking his dream was impossible. Rick assumed Brufston would tell him to give up on becoming an adventurer, but to his surprise, Brufston instead said that Rick would have to train hundreds of times harder than those with natural talent. Rick couldn't believe he accepted that reality, while Brufston simply wondered if Rick was ready to face such an experience. Angelica was so furious with Rick's attitude, and Angelica began to wonder if Brufston's training was really that terrifying. Mizet explained that the training was like hell on earth, and Mizet was amazed that Rick hadn't gone insane after going through it all. How Rick survived more than 2 years of it was a complete mystery. Angelica couldn't believe it because Rick didn't seem to have any skills, but Mizet decided to make himself the subject of exhausting training despite being 40 years old. The others began to reveal that Rick actually had innate talent. It was just that the way to unlock it was complicated. The power Rick possessed couldn't be controlled and had a huge impact on Rick's body, which is why Brufston forbade him from using it. Back at the inn, Rick started doubting himself, wondering if he was pathetic. Rionette didn't think so. Rionette actually said that Rionette would be more like Rick if Rick fought for Brufston. Finally, the day of the final match arrived, and Snape looked more nervous than anyone. Snape was afraid Rick would withdraw just before the fight. Meanwhile, Rick waited near the arena. Rick explained that he had managed to overcome his fear. Rick decided that now all he had to do was throw everything he had learned from Brufston into the fight. Rick tried to appear confident, but it was obvious that he was still scared. In the arena, the announcer started reading out the long list of prizes for the winner, which made the atmosphere even more tense. Since Rick was still scared, Rionette whispered something in his ear, perhaps to calm him down. As both fighters entered the field, Rick boldly declared that he would give everything he had. Brufston, who looked eagerly forward to this match, ordered Rick to apply everything he had taught him. In this battle, every victory mattered, so they started right away. Rick started with flickering footwork, and his movement speed was far faster than Angelica had ever seen before. After some time, Rick finally stopped, and Brufston looked very impressed that Rick managed to make him bleed. Snape wondered what magic was being used, but Angelica explained that they weren't using magic at all. Rick managed to block some strikes, and with quick movements, Rick hurt his opponent using thread slashes. The fight continued as Rick applied pressure, but Brufston pushed him back. Rick narrowly avoided a crushing blow, then countered and landed another thread slash. Angelica was truly amazed by the level of the fight, and started wondering what Rionette had said to Rick before the match began. Rionette revealed her wish for Rick to take her to the hot springs that the tournament winner would get access to. Angelica immediately felt horrified at the assumption that the two of them would become intimate, and Rionette only made things worse by not denying it. On the other hand, Brufston seemed very excited to see Rick come to fight. Brufston had already decided to be rough if Rick just stood still and defended. With enthusiasm, Brufston unleashed an incredibly powerful and terrifying punch, causing mass hysteria among the crowd. Kelvin couldn't believe his eyes. Just one punch from Brufston had more power than a level 5 nature magic spell. Rick knew he wouldn't survive if he ran around recklessly. He had to fully dodge to save his life as Brufston unleashed a barrage of deadly punches. Even so, Rick realized it was all just a distraction, and Angelica began to worry about his safety. Meanwhile, Rionette seemed indifferent, and we could see Rick dodging every single attack. Everyone was shocked when Rick managed to use a simple level 1 magic technique to block Brufston's overwhelmingly powerful attacks. What impressed Kelvin the most was the fact that Rick could activate it without pausing to gather his magic. Brufston wasn't one to be outdone, praising Rick for his precise magic control, especially since even Brufston himself couldn't cast magic without saying its name out loud. Rick wasn't stingy with praise either. He expressed his gratitude to Elisabeth and Mizet for teaching him, though they simply said it was all thanks to Rick's hard work. With incredible speed, Rick tried to land another strike, but unfortunately it didn't do much. Brufston countered with a deadly attack. Everyone began to think Rick had gone crazy for daring to attack Brufston head-on, and Rick was eventually sent flying into the air, where he was most vulnerable. Brufston was ready to finish the fight, but Rick surprised everyone by using the same level 1 magic to throw an air cushion under his feet. This allowed Rick to change the direction of his attack. He then countered with a powerful aerial strike, but unfortunately, Brufston remained unscathed. Angelica was completely mesmerized by their strength. They seemed to surpass human understanding. This was clearly a fight between two rank S fighters. Rick himself couldn't believe that his aerial attack didn't produce the expected results. He realized that maybe he needed to get closer to land a hit. Meanwhile, Brufston was pleased to see that his training with Rick had paid off. But Brufston knew that all of this was possible due to Rick's mental and emotional strength. Hearing that praise made Rick very happy, even though he knew it was the words of a teacher to his student. In truth, Brufston's dream was to fight someone equally matched, and Rick felt he hadn't done enough yet. Rick admitted that he had heard about Brufston's dream from the others, making Brufston look slightly embarrassed and saying they might have exaggerated. Rick didn't fully believe that, as he could see the passion Brufston had when training him. Rick wanted to repay all of Brufston's efforts and declared his intention to fight him with respect. Brufston realized just how fortunate he was, as Rick had truly become a part of their team. That's when Brufston felt it was the right moment to share his story about the past, particularly how the orichalcum fist technique came to be. Looking back 46 years ago, when Brufston was just 5 years old, he realized that he was different from all the other orcs in his group. Besides his appearance, Brufston was also far more intelligent than the others. He began to dive into the world of human books. However, orcs usually preferred to communicate through fighting, and unfortunately, Brufston was too strong to blend in with his kind. Feeling called to make a change, Brufston decided to improve the lives of the orcs. He taught them how to make fire and how to communicate in other ways. Eventually, Brufston was revered as a god, but ironically, no one dared to approach him. This included his own family, so Brufston felt very alone. One day, after returning from scavenging, Brufston found that all the orcs in his village had lost their lives in a flood. Strangely, though, Brufston felt nothing, just a painful reminder of how isolated he was. On a dark night, Brufston was attacked by a human. But the human was shocked to see an orc reading and speaking. Even more surprising, Brufston had defeated a dragon that was terrorizing a town. This man had been hired to kill orcs in the forest, but it was clear that Brufston was no ordinary orc. They began talking about Brufston's situation and how lonely he felt. Brufston wanted a friend who could fight equally with him, but the man doubted that he would ever find one. The man's name was Reinhard, and Reinhard had his own dreams. Reinhard encouraged Brufston to chase their dreams together, explaining that Reinhard had once fought alongside the hero Yamato, who was famous as one of the 5 legendary figures. Reinhard was the one who wrote the book about Yamato's legendary journey. Reinhard had big ambitions to defeat Kaiser El Sepiot, and Reinhard knew just how bold that dream was. However, Reinhard believed that Brufston was actually closer to achieving his dream than Reinhard had realized. So, without hesitation, Brufston agreed to travel with him. This is where all the adventures began. Brufston started living the life of an adventurer, and together with Reinhard, they established the orichalcum fist technique. As Reinhard predicted, many people with strength equal to Brufston's began to gather. Each had their own unique skills, but what Brufston most looked forward to were fist fights, similar to those that often occurred between orcs. At that moment, Brufston started planning his training regimen. However, Miza doubted that anyone on the planet could survive such training. After some time, Brufston nearly gave up on his dream, until Rick came into his life. Back to the present, Brufston was ready to fight. Rick remembered how Brufston had always been by his side during training, but Rick never realized how much time Brufston had spent on him. Rick started thinking about the skills he could use, but he felt unworthy to fight Brufston, as Brufston was clearly looking for a true fistfight. Rick recalled the lesson about orcs who raised their thumbs a quarter of the way up, a sign that both fighters agreed to forget the desire to escape and simply trade blows. Then, everyone was shocked when Rick raised this quarter-thumb gesture to Brufston. Rick felt the need to apologize to Rionette because he realized this meant he wouldn't be able to take her to the hot springs. But Rionette was actually happy. Rick's selflessness was one of the reasons Rionette liked him. On the other side, Brufston returned Rick's gesture, and they began to fight. The power of their punches caused massive destruction, with vibrations felt throughout the arena. As they continued to destroy each other, Rick realized one thing: all of this was thanks to Brufston. Rick was able to chase his dream because of Brufston's support, and now it was time for Rick to repay the favor. Mizet, seeing how dangerous the situation was becoming, quickly asked Elisarette to lend him her magic. Mizet immediately began chanting a spell and swiftly moved the entire audience to safety. Kelvin, confused, asked why Mizet did that, and Mizet explained that the fight between Rick and Brufston could cause incredible damage. Meanwhile, everyone outside the arena had no idea what was happening. Rick and Brufston kept fighting, hitting each other hard. Analysis showed that Rick had landed more punches, but Brufston's punches had far more power per hit. The two warriors exchanged serious blows, and unfortunately, Rick was the one taking the brunt of the damage. Rick could barely stand, but his spirit was unshaken. He refused to give up, feeling he still hadn't repaid his debt to Brufston. The fight continued, their faces meeting in fierce combat. For the first time in the anime, Brufston even laughed. However, in the end, Rick was truly shaken when Brufston sent him flying toward the arena wall. Exhausted, Rick started to wonder if this was the limit of his abilities. Even so, Rick tried to convince himself that his effort was good enough for someone like him. Rick hoped Brufston was satisfied with the fight, but when Rick looked at his sensei, he saw that Brufston still seemed to have energy left for more fighting. Meanwhile, Rick's body was completely drained and unable to move. However, Rick was shocked when he realized he could still move one finger. Angelica assumed Rick could no longer continue the fight, but others disagreed. They explained that Rick wasn't truly finished. In fact, Rick hadn't even been fully serious in the fight yet. With burning determination, Rick began unleashing incredible power. Rionette explained that Rick was using his innate skills to face Brufston. The power flowed through Rick's body, and everyone around celebrated this moment because their goal of surprising Brufston was finally achieved. It turned out they all wanted to help Brufston achieve his dream of fighting an equal opponent. To make this happen, they had given Rick special training and kept it a secret from Brufston. The incredible power continued to surge through Rick's body, and Rionette enthusiastically declared that the real fight had just begun. With renewed energy, Rick returned to the arena, and all the spectators felt the tension in the air. Brufston was impressed by Rick's display of strength, and in his heart, Brufston realized how much everyone cared for him. He also came to understand that he wasn't alone. There were many people who cared about him. Brufston finally admitted that he had friends, and that meant he was no longer alone in his life's journey. The two warriors continued their fight, and for the first time, Brufston felt what it was like to be pushed to the point of exhaustion. Everyone around could feel that both of them had gone beyond their limits, and the next punch would determine everything. They attacked each other with all their might, launching their final blows. However, no one could tell who had won, as both were still standing despite their exhaustion. Rick could barely speak, but he sincerely admitted how incredible Brufston was. Rick explained that even after all his efforts and struggles, he still wasn't able to defeat Brufston. Meanwhile, Brufston didn't fully understand what Rick was talking about. Brufston explained that they could reach this point because Rick chose to follow Brufston's dream and fight alongside him. Sincerely, Brufston stated that the victory should belong to Rick, and then he passed out immediately. Later, Rick woke up after sleeping for 3 full days, feeling the warmth of friendship and the struggles they had gone through. Rick was still confused about why he received the champion belt, so Brufston patiently explained that it was all because Rick managed to win the role. Rick felt grateful, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't be able to defeat Brufston if he kept relying on his healing abilities alone. Brufston, who didn't want Rick to belittle himself, confidently said that Rick was incredibly strong. Brufston also thanked all the friends around them, acknowledging how much they all meant to him. Now, their group had obtained the second gem out of the 6 they were searching for, so they were one step closer to Yamato and Kaiser El Sepia. They also managed to get a fake substitute gem to put into the belt, so it seemed like their plan was coming together. At that moment, Rick couldn't help his curiosity and wondered how old Reinhard was, considering Reinhard had fought alongside Yamato more than 200 years ago. Although Reinhard's exact age remained a mystery, it was clear that his innate skills had extended his life. That night, Snape explained that both Rick and Brufston refused to be considered winners. This tournament couldn't be left without a champion, so Kelvin officially became the champion again. Kelvin seemed dissatisfied with this decision, and Snape asked him to at least keep an eye on the champion belt. While our group was getting ready to go home, everyone started to swarm Rick because he was trying to take home too much food. Brufston thought about Reinhard and hoped he could tell him that his dream had finally come true. Angelica also waved to say goodbye, and Rick was surprised to hear that she wouldn't be coming back since Brufston had already promised to train her. Rick couldn't believe Angelica was willing to sacrifice her life for that, but Angelica remained determined to catch up to Rick and even surpass him. Rick said he planned to go home because he was already late and starting his E-rank adventure quest. However, Angelica argued that Rick was actually already an S-rank adventurer. Angelica thought Rick would run the usual 500 kilometers, but she was shocked when Rick mentioned that their home was 2,800 kilometers away. Angelica started to panic, worried that their food would spoil on the long journey, but Mizet quickly used enhancement magic to strengthen his horse for the long distance. Rick was all set to leave, but Rionette immediately asked when they could take a trip to the hot springs. Brufston reminded her that Rick had actually won the tournament, and Rick started to imagine how exciting that trip would be. However, Rick quickly said that he hadn't actually won, and Mizet agreed, saying that the result was a tie. Not wanting to miss out, Mizet suggested they race home. If Rick lost, he would have to go to the hot springs and also do 100 training sessions. The race started, but Rick stayed behind to make a promise to Rionette. Rick said he would definitely take her to the hot springs someday. Rick clearly didn't want to go through with the 100 training sessions. As they ran back, Rick remembered how long it took him, but his dream of becoming an adventurer had finally come true. And this wasn't the end because Rick still had other dreams waiting, no matter how old he got.